much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
You are absolutely welcome, and it's my pleasure. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. Can you talk a little bit about your journey into mental health? And by that, I mean, how did you decide that you wanted to be a mental health professional? And then once you did make that decision, what was your journey like to serving the population that you now specialize in?
Yeah, I think it would be easier to say that I always knew, but that's definitely not what my journey or path included. I actually started out doing all the business courses, economics, accounting, principles of business, intended to minor in economics in undergrad. But then it ended up that when I got introduced to sociology right at the ending of high school, I was really intrigued by different cultures and just how the mind and people and systems worked. And then in living in Jamaica, mental health and behavioral health issues are really stigmatized, so no importance is given to that. And I lived within really close proximity to one of the oldest mental health institutions in the Caribbean. So, with being in close proximity to that and just exposure to people who it was obvious that they had mental health issues, but societally and then within the government system, no care was given to that, I became really intrigued about, well, similarly to business or with economics, it's providing an answer or solution to a problem that exists from a supply and demand standpoint. The demand obviously wasn't there, but there was definitely the need and supply. So logically, that's initially how I went into it. And then in terms of choosing the population for specialty, when I went into my master's program, I focused on cultural differences with the American population versus immigrant populations, such as the Jamaican society, and found out that there really isn't necessarily a cultural difference. It's more so a racial difference that's happening that the in my research, and of course it's the graduate level, so it had some limitations, but what the results really showed was that it's not necessarily that cultural differences exist between the immigrant population and then the American population. It was just more about how the white survey respondents versus anyone that identified as Black or Brown, whether in the US or in the Caribbean, was viewing mental health issues. So from there, I knew I really wanted to focus on serving my community in that aspect. And then it was more about what was the specific issue or population that I wanted to, and trauma just became something that I was really passionate about, and working in forensic populations that no one really, or not necessarily that no one does the work, but it's really minimized about the impact of like adverse childhood experiences and someone's life trajectory. So it's kind of my meandering path into psychology.
Wow, that's really interesting for so many reasons. Can you talk a little bit about with the research that you did? You said that you really found the significant differences in terms of the responses about mental health between anyone who identified as white or European and those who identified as other or Black or brown or whatever. Was there any specific information in terms of those differences about how they spoke about mental health? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so from my thesis study, what it revealed was that anyone who identified as white or non-Black or brown identifying, that they were more likely to engage in psychological help seeking outside of communal or religious spaces. And also they were more likely to seek services for symptoms that reflected depression or anxiety versus the Black and brown community. From that survey sample, they were more likely to engage in help seeking behaviors when it included anything to do with psychosis. Like, that's really when mental health services were viewed as a necessity beyond religious spaces or communal services.
Okay. And so for the respondents who identified as Black or Brown, in terms of mental health, was there more of, so there's like a lot of research kind of in this area in terms of the differences in the utilization of mental health services. And some of it talks about how in like the Black community, in for people who identify as Black and Brown, there's more of a reliance on like religious institutions or religious figures to talk about or deal with these issues. They go to the church first or an elder first or something like that. Is that what you also kind of found in your research?
So that would have been one of the limitations of my research, in that that question wasn't asked. So what I had to do is do it like retrospectively, looking at the literature, saying what was existing research at the time saying about the population. And you are right in that that was one of the key factors, as well as the potential for mistrust in mental health services or just healthcare providers in general, as well as identity within religious spaces, that space has been a source of refuge and relief and just sustenance and care for the population. So that was viewed as more as a priority, but it wasn't a question that I directly asked in terms of why wouldn't you seek the options that were provided in the survey response options.
Okay. Absolutely. And I mean, that's why you have the future directions section, right? It's to talk
Right.
about stuff like that, to say, well, next time let's do, all these things.
Yeah.
So that's really cool. That's really necessary and really interesting research. Another thing that you mentioned that is, one of my really big interests and my original love why I got into this was the forensic part of it that you mentioned, the forensic populations. Can you talk a little bit more about those populations that you were interested in, and what kind of, connections you had there? Like what kind of interests you had with working with those populations?
Of course, it's back to, part of my meandering story about how I got into the field. That my very first job out of grad school was working at a residential treatment facility on a unit that was specifically focused on male youth who were either adjudicated of a sexual offense or their family members had sought out care services because like inappropriate sexual behaviors were happening in the home. So that was my first introduction to that. I did that for a year. And then after that, for approximately 5 years, I moved on to working with people who were adult males who had an intellectual developmental disability, and then they too were adjudicated of a sexual offense and mandated to specialized sexual offender treatment.
Okay. Those are really interesting populations because they're, you talked about the adverse childhood experiences, and there's so much that has gone on that has led them to, sitting across from you, to having to be in, those facilities or being under those circumstances. And I always applaud anytime anyone actually recognizes that and accounts for that, because I think that unfortunately, we do that too little. Like there's just this idea that, well, you did this is what's going to happen, as opposed to absolutely accountability 100%. But let's talk about how we got here and why we got here. So I think that's, really great that you're, interested in that, aspect. Can you talk a little bit about, and we'll talk about more about your practice later, but right now you're in private practice, right?
I am.
And so who are the people that you see in your private practice?
So predominantly, and I think it's more of marketing and my interest in trauma therapy, that it's predominantly folks who are interested in working on unresolved trauma, or people who are really struggling with anxiety, depression, and then identity formation. And that can be within any realm of their social identity.
Okay, excellent. And can you talk a little bit about the most stressful thing about your job for you?
The most stressful thing I would say is keeping current and up to date with trainings, because I want to learn all the things and to be, following best practices in the field. But there's always something new to learn and a new approach to really get engaged with. So my biggest struggle right now is slowing down and really getting more competent in some of the trainings that I do have, while also seeking out more trainings to ensure that, I'm always serving the clients and putting their needs at the forefront.
Right. Absolutely. And if you think about it, I mean, you could fill your days with trainings. There are just so many of them, and there's so many interesting things to learn. And there's so many advances and so many changes and things coming out. It's hard to keep up with it if you're, in the trenches treating people, right?
Right. And the cost components of the trainings as well.
Right. That's a really good point, that they do definitely add up. Absolutely. Can you talk a little bit about self-care, what self-care is for you, what that means to you, and how you practice it?
So self-care for me looks like a lot of boundary setting, and even setting boundaries with myself. In working in private practice, one of the transitions I didn't prepare for adequately, and I had to do that more retrospectively, was setting the boundaries with when am I going to take time off. Because working with agencies and other companies, there's a structure in place where you're taking paid time off. And in private practice, that isn't built in. If you're not working, you're not getting paid, but reminding myself that I need to take time off to then restore myself for myself as well as my clients. So lots of boundary setting with myself, that I look out in the calendar and decide here are the times that I'm taking off, regardless of what may be happening within the practice, that I'm building in time for myself. And then with the advent of telehealth becoming more popularized, I would say, because when I was in grad school, it wasn't something that was promoted or given any light with regards to training and promoting it as a modality. So what I noticed that I've started to do for self-care in the telehealth environment is that prior to telehealth, I would schedule a 7 o'clock therapy session and would be okay with that, being in the office, being with a client. But now with the excess time on screen, and then the boundary being blurred between taking work home, since now work is in the home, that I have lessened my caseload per day. So I'm doing less session, ending earlier in the day.
Okay. Nice. So it's all about just setting boundaries and knowing what you can do and what you can't do, and making sure that you stick with that.
Yeah.
That makes sense. All right. And something that you said, you talked a little bit about the change transferring to teletherapy. Now, I usually ask how your practice has changed since COVID-19. And so can you talk about the teletherapy part? I imagine is part of how your practice changed, but were there, in addition to that, other ways that you had to sort of tweak your services so that you could still serve the people that you serve?
I think it's the telehealth that's the largest change, in that I wasn't a telehealth provider back in March of 2020, when I realized that, well, we can't necessarily be in an office space. I actually paused for a few weeks to say, all right, I'm figuring out what's the process, figuring out the software to ensure that I'm still providing a service that not only is the quality okay, but also that it's following the requirements for HIPAA. So I'm not just like opening it up to video or phone calls, that I'm not ensuring that the client information and confidentiality is not being maintained. So I initially took some time off and back to trainings. I did a whole 12-hour training on how do I do this to ensure that it's being done properly. So that was the biggest hump for me, because I've never provided telehealth before the pandemic.
Right. And yeah, those are all things that you have to sort of learn, things that you know, hadn't done before. And there's always a way to do it. And we as mental health professionals have that extra burden of making sure that our clients' information is protected at all times and doing everything we can.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, was there any kind of adjustment for you going from face-to-face sessions to having to have a screen in between yourself and the clients? Was there an adjustment to that aspect of treatment for you?
Initially, it felt impersonal, but I didn't think that lasted long for me. So the only adjustment for existing clients, because there was some apprehension there initially, was rebuilding rapport through the screen. And as much as they're now in my home, I'm also in their home as well, and like getting accommodated to each other's like backgrounds, the noise, the kind of the textures of the setting that the therapy is happening in. So that was something that took some adjusting to, as well as figuring out my onboarding process for new clients. So some of the questions that I had to ask were a little different, just to ensure that new clients coming in understood that confidentiality and privacy was still important, and they needed to take some accountability for providing that in their space. So that part of it looked different in terms of prior to COVID and providing telehealth. Those questions weren't a thing for me. It was just the understanding that they're showing up to the office and I'm providing the privacy within the therapy room for them.
Okay. Yeah, those are good points. And I really like your referring to it as the textures, because I think that paints a very accurate and vivid picture of the different, I think a lot of times people use the term layers, but I think textures just gives it a little bit more life. And that's what it is. Like there are so many of them involved in the whole process of treatment. So I like that a lot. And can you talk about, so you said that one of the changes was the idea of now things are completely telehealth. And something else you mentioned was just, you know, taking work home with you. Before, when you were going from an office to home, there's somewhat more of a boundary in there, because you know that you're packing up, you're getting ready to leave, you're going to leave this place, and then you're going to go home. But when work is in the home, those boundaries get, you know, a little bit more blurred. Can you talk a little bit about like any specific things that you had to implement for yourself to know that, you know, it's time to stop. I'm not going to write one more note. I'm not going to run and get a snack and then finish this later tonight. I have to stop work now. How'd you do that for yourself?
So two things I did with the boundaries. Initially, I realized that if I had a break, I was doing maybe like a home chore. So even with that, it's figuring, well, am I at home or am I like within my workspace that I need to be in? So I discontinued doing that and kind of like these are my work hours and I'm using that for work. I'm not necessarily introducing the personal tasks that I have to do at home or chores stuff within that. So having the boundaries with time in terms of not just the limitations of starting and ending, but what's happening within the work hours. That's something that I looked at. The other thing that I did is that the space that I typically do my therapy sessions in, I ensured that I started keeping all my documents or files or worksheets or anything that I needed with me in that space, or rather than having it, for example, moving my computer or my microphone to my dining table or something and doing notes there. I ensured that everything that was a work task was being done within the same space. So giving my body that habit of developing the transition that if I'm in this space, it's for work. And if I'm anywhere else within the home doing a task or activity, it's non-work related.
Right.
So like environmental boundaries.
Right. And those are little, I love that, because those are little tweaks that you don't necessarily think about firsthand. Many people think of the idea of just the time. and saying from this hour to this hour, I'm going to be working. But what about that idea of environment of, well, I'm not just going to take my stuff over to the couch to work there,
Right.
because, space is very important in setting boundaries as well. And so that's super interesting. I like that. I like that aspect of it as well. Have you ever had a time going, talking about just the boundary issue and, setting boundaries for yourself? Was there ever a time for you that you realized you were putting your clients' needs before your mental and or physical health? And, if so, what was that like when you realized it?
So I'm sure it's happened many times before, potentially, especially when I was a young therapist. But a moment that's standing out for me was last summer when there were those social uprising, the Black Lives Matter movement. That was a time that I realized that, as not only are we going through a global pandemic, I'm experiencing that with the clients, there's also this issue that I'm very passionate about, and these movements within society that's affecting me mentally and emotionally, and recognizing that as much as I'm providing space and opportunities for clients to process those, I also needed to step back and figure out where am I doing that so it's not affecting clients, and I'm also taking care of myself. So that was a period that I had to realize, well, I have to pause, take some moments for myself before re-engaging with clients.
Okay. All right. And, speaking of, last summer, everything that went on, now we're still in the, throes of the pandemic, but with everything that went on in 2020 and 2021, the pandemic and the social injustice and, watching unarmed Black citizens being, murdered in the streets with no provocation or very little provocation, to watching the escalating random violent unprovoked attacks on Asians and the terror attack on the Capitol earlier this year. Just so many things going on. Can you talk a little bit about how those things, if they did impact your own mental health as a Black mental health professional, how they impacted your mental health?
Yeah, I look back at that time, especially last summer, and realized that my sleep quality really deteriorated at that time, and coming to terms and acknowledging for myself that it was really like the grief that I was experiencing at that time, and even like not necessarily normalizing, but validating that my experience of what's happening is a direct symptom, essentially, of my experience with race-based stress or racial trauma that's happening vicariously. That obviously the thing didn't happen to me, but I'm experiencing that as well. It could have very well be me in my home sleeping or going about my everyday life in society and be victim to that experience.
Absolutely. And I think that's part of what makes it so difficult, is watching these things play over and over and over again. And it's not even necessarily the same incident that you see repeatedly during a news cycle for a week or 2 weeks or whatever, because, then something even more horrific happens, and then you're watching that over and over again. And it's that idea that it could, as just as you said, be any one of us. It could be you, it could be me, walking down the street, barbecuing, bird watching. I mean, now there's just a ridiculous list of things that,
Right.
we're not free
Running,
to do,
sleeping.
or that running, exactly. Like it's, what can we do and be assured that we're not going to end up murdered. And really the answer is nothing. Like there is no activity left sitting in your own apartment eating ice cream. So yeah, there is that aspect of it that's just kind of like realizing that you are being, traumatized vicariously. And can you talk a little bit about, so with that idea that we're watching all these things unfold around us, we know that this could have been us and could be us at any given time. But, a couple things. A lot of us are, we're taught, and we've been talking about in training what you're taught versus like what actually happens. So in our training, we're taught to find a way to sort of disconnect from our client struggles, right? Disconnect from everything that's going on so that you can, take care of yourself. You can replenish your psychological stores. You can replenish your physical stores, your emotional stores, all that stuff. But for us as Black mental health professionals, we're seeing things that constantly affect us, and we're listening to our clients that have these similar fears, especially for those of us who are working within minority communities. And so we're hearing these things day in and day out about their fears, which are valid because there are fears too. So we can't really disconnect from our work with our clients or their stories or their fears, because their fears are our fears, because we are part of the community and we're seeing the same things. So can you talk a little bit about how you are, in light of the fact that you are a mental health professional of color, in light of the fact that you can't disconnect because this affects you, how are you still able to take care of your own mental health and replenish your own psychological stores enough so that you can continue to every day go into work and continue to serve the people that you serve?
So for me, something that I try to do every day is connecting with a friend, and not connecting with my therapist friend, but connecting with a friend, potentially one that's not in the field, and also doing that through an actual live phone call. Because I realized that naturally I had just gotten in the habit of maybe having conversations through text messages, like a lengthy conversation is happening through a group chat or text message, and getting back to the basics of having a live conversation with my friends.
Absolutely. And that makes a difference for you, that kind of that live connection with someone who is, pardon me, outside of the field, is not, hearing these traumatic things over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Okay.
And checking in what's going on in their workday and just life in general as it's happening, because it's very different from the day-to-day experiences of a therapist.
Right. Yeah, that's very true. Okay. And are there any challenges for you in terms of, not only that aspect, but other aspects of self-care? Are there any things that keep coming up that make it a little bit more difficult for you to make sure that you're practicing, self-care on a regular basis?
Yeah, one of the challenges for me is catching myself when I'm having that internal monologue of minimizing the need to take time for self-care, or pushing it off. Well, I can do it on the weekend, or I can
Right.
do it at the end of the work week, and realizing that it's something that can be done during the week on any given day at any given time, because something that may seem seemingly small as a self-care task for me is having a nice meal. So for me, making the time to prepare, to shop for the items, to make this nice meal, those are really small tasks that are self-care centered and can be spread out and not just clumped into one big thing at the end of the week. So that's something in terms of me reframing what self-care looks like, and not limiting it to, well, it's something that I do on the weekend to unwind.
Right. That's a great point. And I love that idea of making it, like you talked about with the meal, preparing the meal, enjoying the meal. So it's something that is intentional, and it's an intentional part of your day, as opposed to after you've just been working a ridiculous number of hours saying, well, I just need to eat something, so I'm just going to throw something together, but enjoying that experience of creating nutrients for your body that you know are going to be really good for you.
Yeah.
I like that. Nice. And just out of curiosity, because you talked about, you know, trying to sort of push back against that temptation to just sort of push off the self-care and say, I'll do it later. I'll do it on the weekend. I'll do it some other time. I don't know about you, but for me, that's especially hard. For example, like when I'm on a roll, when I'm doing something and I'm like just in the zone, or I'm getting stuff done and I'm on a roll, I'm just like, just one more hour. I can do this. I can kind of, you know, get some more stuff done. Does that ever happen to you in terms of like just wanting to do a little bit more before you stop for the day or for whatever time period you've set for yourself?
It does. And that's where I get to catching myself that there will always be more to be done on any given day. And what's important is if I'm not taken care of, then I can't sustain that being in the role.
Yes, absolutely. Wow. Well, thank you so much for this. This is really interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about your practice? Let everybody know what your practice is called, what it's called, where it's located, and how people can get in touch with you.
Okay. So my practice is called Melanated Women's Health. And don't be disillusioned by the name, even though it's marketed for women who identify as Black or person of color. The practice serves people with all social identities. Initially, it started off as a solo practice, but right now there are some therapists who will be joining. Everyone at the practice is licensed in Pennsylvania. So what that means is if anyone is outside of Pennsylvania, even though telehealth makes therapy accessible, we only serve people who are located in Pennsylvania.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you. And I know that for most of us, we got into this to help people, but aside from helping people, can you tell me one of your favorite things about being a mental health professional?
The work day is ever changing. I mean, I've never gotten bored in my work day as a therapist because it's one of the professions where you're constantly meeting new people and being involved in a very humble way, a part of, their life experiences and growth journey.
Nice. That's excellent. Okay. I don't know if you've had a chance to listen to any of the previous episodes of the show, but at the very end, what I like to do is something called the finisher. It's just a random question or two that has nothing to do with mental health or self-care, anything like that. It's just, I like asking people random questions just because It's something I've always liked. So let's see, for you, what is your favorite movie of all time?
Kung Fu Hustle.
Kung Fu Hustle? Very nice. And tell me why.
Yeah. So for me, everyone who I ever share this with, they say it's a comedy. And for me, I don't know if I watched it as a young person, but for me, I just love the romance aspect of it. That here's a character that has a disability, and the way that the two main characters are going about forging a romantic relationship. Just love the idea of it.
That's awesome. Wait, who's in Kung Fu Hustle?
So that I don't know the names of. It's an Asian-based movie.
Oh, okay.
Were you thinking of something else?
Yes, Kung Fu Panda, which is very different from This is very different, I think.
Yeah, I think I recently saw it on Netflix. So it's a really old movie.
Okay, got it. All right, I'm gonna look that up because I don't know that I've ever heard of that movie.
People typically haven't.
Huh?
People typically haven't, and I may have first watched it like over 10 years ago.
Okay, but it stuck with you, and you really liked it. It really spoke with you. That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah.
And what was your favorite TV show in middle school?
Middle school. So here's the thing with that question. As a Jamaican, our school system isn't structured like elementary, middle, high. So I have to look into my brain to see what age range is in middle school.
Let's say,
give me an age range.
11, 12, 13, or like 12, 13, like 11 to 13 around there.
So 11 to 13 probably was something like, Are You Afraid of the Dark?
Oh, what is that, like Nickelodeon or something? Or
one of those,
like, okay.
Yeah, I look back at it like, that wasn't that scary, but coming home from school afterwards watching that, I remember being like scared, like, oh, there's panic happening in this.
Okay, all right, so the scary stuff. As an adult, are you a fan of like horror or thrillers or anything like that?
I do not. I actually do not watch anything that involves like gore or horror. It gives me nightmares. So I figured that out early and decided it's not for me. I don't have to put myself through that.
Right. That makes sense. That makes absolute sense. And I figure you probably, hear stressful and terrible things all day anyway. So to go home and then watch more of that, is probably not, the best way to sort of relax. So that makes sense.
It's all about listening to your body and respecting the signals that it sends.
Yep, 100%. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here today, for sharing your thoughts. I really enjoyed our interview. So thank you once again, Nicola Pierre-Smith, and take care.
Thank you so much for having me. And the conversation was a lovely switch up to my typical workday. So thank you for that.
Oh, fantastic. I'm happy to hear that. You're welcome. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.